Good afternoon. Thank you for coming back into the session so promptly. My name's Beck and I'm going to be spending the next hour or so with you with a few other guests. And it's a great pleasure to be looking after the anxiety into action session because I'm feeling quite anxious at the moment. I don't know if in the room what the vibe is like. Is anyone feeling that sense of anxiety or discomfort about where we're going? Well, consider yourself lucky you're not doing public speaking at the same time. So we're going to do our best to make it a bit of an uplifting conversation to the extent that we can. You're going to be hearing from some excellent panelists. Shaz, who's at the front, who I know is also very much looking forward to being on stage. Zoe, who's likewise saying that she's going to be fighting with Shaz for the microphone to see who they can pass it off onto. And Valeska, who's somewhere in the room. Valeska, hello, that's why we were smiling at each other before. Nice to meet you, so close before the panel. But before we get to the discussion, we've actually got a very special speaker who's with us today, and this is Hannah. And please allow me to read a little bit of info about why you're going to be hearing from Hannah before I invite Hannah up to the front. So in 2021, a group of Australian children challenged the federal government in court on the grounds that they should not approve a coal mine expansion because it would exacerbate climate change, causing harm to young people. Some of you might be familiar or recall as this was happening. Ultimately, the Federal Court of Australia established that the Australian government does not currently have a legal duty of care to young people, and that this would need to be established by the Parliament. So just in case you missed out what I said there, because it cut out at the exact moment, established that the government does not have a legal duty of care. So if it was to have a duty of care, that would have to be enacted by Parliament. Senator David Pocock has proposed an amendment to the Climate Change Act known as the Duty of Care and Intergenerational Climate Equity Bill that will see this duty of care established, or if it's passed, it will. Before we begin the panel, I'm delighted to invite Hannah Vardy, who's an ANU undergraduate science and law student, and Hannah's been one of the people working on the Duty of Care campaign. So Hannah's going to open our session. We've got 8-ish minutes. They become very precise in these event run sheets. And Hannah's going to talk a little bit about taking anxiety into action, especially from this perspective. So thank you, Hannah. Welcome to the front.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Beck, for that introduction. As mentioned, my name is Hannah. I'm in my third year here at ANU, studying climate science, molecular biology, and law. I'm here today to speak to you not only as academics, bureaucrats, students, and concerned citizens, but as people. As parents of children growing up in a world that's growing even more uncertain and volatile day by day. As grandparents, worried about the future that you're leaving your grandkids. At the end of the day, we are all people who are trying our best to solve one of the greatest challenges of our time while facing the daily anxieties that come with this task. For those that saw them, the quotes on the slides before do illustrate this anxiety. I'm here to discuss one way that I've found has transformed some of this anxiety into action. Since August last year, I volunteered with 3 other ANU students on the Duty of Care campaign. This team includes Anjali Sharma, who in 2020 was the lead litigant in a case involving 8 young people who took the then Environment Minister, Susan Lee, to court. They argue that she had a duty of care to all young Australians and future generations to consider the climate impacts when approving fossil fuel projects. The court initially found that such a duty did exist, but this existed for all of about 6 months before the Federal Environment Minister took the kids back to court and this was overturned on appeal. So when Anjali moved to Canberra, she approached Senator Pocock about enshrining this duty through legislation. And the bill was introduced into the Senate in July last year. In short, the bill amends the Climate Change Act to establish that the relevant decision maker, such as the Environment Minister, must consider the health and well-being of current and future Australian young people when making decisions that could worsen climate change, such as approving a fossil fuel project or coal mine. It would mean that a decision maker could reject a fossil fuel project based on its likely impacts on young people and generations to come. We've received overwhelming support for the bill all across the country since it was introduced. We've had over 400 submissions received, which is a mammoth number when you look through other similar inquiries. We've had a yoga studio in the outer suburbs of Adelaide run a submissions writing night for their community. We received a heartwarming submission supporting the bill from a miner who worked in the coal industry in central Queensland for 43 years. It is now advocating for a just transition for workers. We've also received incredible levels of support from peak bodies of scientists, health practitioners, GPs and obstetricians, as well as the ANU, calling for the government to support the bill for its protection of the health and well-being of young people in the face of climate change. As I was reading through these hundreds of submissions that came pouring in, the ones that struck me the most were from parents, terrified for what the future holds for their children and finding a sense of hope in what this bill could do to help alleviate the worst impacts of climate change. Even more startling were the submissions from people who had dreamed of becoming parents since childhood, but were too afraid of the future that they'd be leaving their children to even consider it. This bill is so critical to young people, as it would acknowledge, for the first time under Australian law, that we will bear the brunt of climate change the worst. Our lives and livelihoods will be grossly affected by a crisis largely not of our making. But this panel session is all about taking action to lessen the impacts of this crisis. So in November last year, we brought 25 young people from across the country to federal parliament to meet with over 40 MPs in a single day. In those meetings, we asked the MP to sign a pledge supporting the duty of care in principle, which 28 MPs did, as we can see on the screen, including 10 government MPs. We really did get some odd looks from advisors and politicians as teenagers and primary school kids rushed around Parliament House trying to find the location of the next MP's office. This day was not only important for the campaign, but highlighted the power of young people in taking action to protect our future. Over the last few years, we've heard so much rhetoric in the media about our disengagement of young people in politics, about our apathy and despair about what our future holds. These feelings are powerful, and hearing the recent research that Mark went through before the break are often completely justified. But to me, anxiety and despair doesn't solve anything, nor does giving up on our future. There are so many ways to respond to the challenge of climate change, and we see this campaign and political engagement more broadly as one of them. To any young people in the room or listening online at home, you have power. Request a meeting with your MP. Join a local climate action group. Advocate for sustainable policies in your workplace and community groups. Together, we can shift the dial on climate action one step at a time. However, taking action on climate can not only involve young people. We all need to use our skills, our interests, our networks to advocate for a safer future. If you're interested in supporting the campaign, you can sign the petition at thedutyofcare.com.au and can share it around any networks you might be connected with. But we know that engaging with politics is not for everyone. There are countless other actions that we can take. Join a local gardening group to restore a natural environment. Move your money away from banks and super funds that invest in fossil fuels, or have conversations with your family and friends about these issues. My hope for you from today's discussion is that you find ways to spur action as part of your community. In my belief, it is one of the most powerful ways to alleviate the anxiety shared among many about our future. With that, I'd like to hand back over to Beck to introduce our fabulous panel members. Thank you very much.
Good on you, Hannah, and thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think we heard some encouraging murmurs from the audience as you were speaking. So I suspect there's a lot of appreciation for the efforts that you've taken and what it is that you're pursuing, the positive change. And it is quite a nice lead into the panel session that we've got actually. And there were a couple of things that you mentioned that from speaking with some of our panelists beforehand, I know pick up on themes that we're likely to talk more about. You mentioned about politics not being for everyone and lots of the other great places that people can use those muscles that are there that we know can be so empowering when you're sitting in that space of anxiety or concern. You talked about conversations, and that makes me think of a conversation with Anna Greta. And what was the exact phrase that you said before? Thank you. So for anyone who didn't hear that, that's Dr. Anna Greta Hunter. Oh yeah, all right. I can assure you she does more than just make these one-liners, but very deserving of the applause. Anna Greta Hunter, so make change one conversation at a time. And I think that will be a theme that we pick up on over the next little while. So it's about 5:10, and we're going to keep going until about 10 to 6. So you can do the maths because I can't. We've got a bit under an hour, a bit more than half an hour to have this panel discussion. So I'd like to invite our panelists up to take a seat in the seats that we've got. That'll be a good place to start. And as coming up and taking a seat, I'll tell you a bit about who we've got for the next little while. So you can see Sharon in the middle, that's Shaz, Sharon Forwood. So Shaz is a visiting fellow here at the ANU with the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. And Shaz is also a high school geography teacher. So she's our first visiting fellow who comes as a school educational practitioner. And one of the reasons that Shaz is here with us is that she's been leading quite a novel partnership, and in my opinion, quite a forward-looking partnership, if I may say so, between her school, Kildare Catholic College in Wagga Wagga, and the ANU. This also involves Tanya Russell, a PhD scholar, who's going to be mortified that I've pointed her out. But can you wave, Tanya, where you are? Yeah, good on you. Thank you. And it's going to be looking at how Shaz's school, Kildare, is going through a process of change in response to climate change. And a big part of that is thinking about what makes sense to the school, what's relevant to people there, and in some ways expanding the idea of what it means to be doing climate action. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, I hope. They dagger eyes or approval eyes, Shaz? Yeah, okay, she's approving. That's great. We've also got Zoe Leviston. So Zoe's on the end there with the blue shirt and the black jacket. And Zoe's with the ANU College of Health and Medicine. And if I remember correctly, a McMichael fellow, is that the right term? So that's sort of a prestigious appointment that Zoe has in recognition of her contribution to research. So Zoe's a psychologist. She's published in some of the top journals. It's better if I'm back here, is it, the audio? Anyway, published in some of the top journals, and some of Zoe's work that quite influenced my own research was looking at how it is that people perceive the distribution of attitudes toward climate change out there in society, in the world, and how that might differ or not from the actual distribution of people's attitudes. So Zoe's finding there was that there was a perception gap, is that right? Where people expect there to be a greater proportion of folks that reject the evidence on climate change in the community in relation to what the reality is. And we can probably assume that part of that is because sometimes extreme views get inflated because they make for a much more interesting story in the media, for instance. Or it might be that people who hold those more extreme views tend to sing them a little bit louder. But anyway, I'm stealing Zoe's thunder, so you'll be hearing from Zoe as well. We also have Professor Valeska Ting. And so Valeska is sitting here nearest to me. She's the Associate Dean for Engagement, Research and Impact in the ANU College of Engineering, Computing and Cybernetics. And her space is in the smart nano materials. So where we're going to be hearing a bit about the social and the psychological dimensions from Shaz and Zoe, we're going to be hearing about some of these technological innovations from Valeska. And bringing them together gives us a really, well, I'm hoping, and if our panel delivers on the brief, quite an uplifting view for the future following from what we had from Mark earlier. So we might get started. I'll join the panel at the table. And we'll start by me putting some questions to our panelists, but then we'll open up and we'll have time for questions from the audience, including online for those folks who are joining us online. Thank you for doing so. So to start with, what do we mean by action when we think about climate change? And we can think perhaps in terms of collective action, individual action, policy, and technological change. I'd like to hear from each of you, from your perspectives, when you hear that term action, what does it mean? Zoe, you've got the microphone, so you can get us started.
Nice. Yeah, how long's a piece of string? So if we take something like collective action, I guess what immediately comes to mind is people shouting through megaphones, as we've seen through some of the imagery presented today. And certainly from my perspective, from social psychology, that's typically what we investigate. It's highly visible, it's highly efficacious, but actually not a lot of people engage in it. You're only going to get a minority of people ever kind of taking to the streets, as it were. But if we look at what collective action means, we can think of it as action taken on behalf of the group to improve the conditions of that group. And once we have a more encompassing definition to work with, it opens up a whole lot of other actions that we normally wouldn't think about. And Hannah talked about some of those. It could be joining your local gardening group or getting engaged in a citizen science project or something like that. It's all actions taken on behalf of the group, and that can be a human group or it can be a non-human group as well, to improve the conditions of that group. So I think that we should have that more holistic definition of what we mean by action when we're thinking about climate change.
Thank you, Zoe. Could you chuck the microphone over to Shaz? Thank you. Go for it, Shaz.
Okay, so I agree with Zoe. You hear terms like action and collective action, and it brings to mind a whole lot of images of protests and visible action, I guess. For me, the word action is a deliberate choice to lean in to do something. And if you think about collective action in that context, then all of a sudden you're talking about a group of people all leaning in to do something for hopefully a common good. And once you're doing that, you're starting to talk about relationships, network, community building, and you start to talk about action probably characterized, I guess, by compassion and generosity and love and care. And that's not to say that the, visible protest is not about that. It absolutely is. But we have a spectrum where people have different levels of comfort to where they want to lean in on that. And I think that idea of just leaning in with compassion, generosity and care is a place where a lot of people can feel fairly comfortable.
Thank you, Shaz. And Valeska, it would be great to hear from your perspective.
Okay, so I guess the first thing I think about when I'm thinking about action is thinking back to what Genevieve was saying at the opening of this event, where she was talking about choices and so making deliberate choices for the greater good. And so from my point of view, I guess I work in energy technologies, looking at decarbonisation, and so the actions that researchers and people working in industry or technology have at their disposal might be more directed in terms of things where they're contributing to solutions, but the uptake of those solutions, that's action that can be taken by anyone in society. And so that spreading of information, spreading of the information about options and giving people the choice, I think that's an important component of action.
Awesome, thank you. So something that comes through there really speaks to some of Mark's earlier, which is that we're using this term action as if it's a singular thing, like you've got a bag and it's full of a thing and that thing is action. It's a terrible analogy. But actually there's a whole lot of different ways of taking action, and it can range from working with the people in your networks, having conversations that encourage that mutual care and bring people together. It's about looking past the protest movement solely, not to exclude those. As we know, there's a huge amount of literature that speaks to the importance of them in processes of social change, but also it's the research and it's the development and then the implementation and the uptake of those sorts of technologies as well. So we've talked now a little bit about action and how that's understood by our panelists. So I think we can probably go to the easy bit of the question, which is how do you get to that point from a place of anxiety? And so Valeska, by virtue of you holding the microphone, would you be open to talking to us perhaps from the perspective of being in the science space and really seeing some of the forefront of these discoveries? What does it mean for whether you want to speak about your own sense of hope or the other side for the future, but what you see amongst your students and your colleagues and the way that you engage in that research and impact space? What do these technological developments mean for you?
Well, I think I'm very lucky in that. So if you think back to the slide that Mark presented about all of the different technological options that we have available that can be used to decarbonize. So from my point of view, working in the research in these areas, you're seeing the best developments, the most exciting research that's coming out, and that naturally gives you this feeling of hope, and so you see it in the PhD researchers and the undergraduates that you interact with, and I'm sure Chaz sees it in the children at school as well. Like this idea that people are working hard to try and solve some of these big global challenges. And from a personal point of view, it's what gets me up in the morning. Like, you know, this idea that you could be doing something that makes a difference. But I think that lends itself to a lot of optimism, but then being pragmatic as well about how we translate those developments, which have a lot of potential, how we translate them to actual widespread implementation and something where it's not even a choice anymore. It's just how we go about our everyday lives. Like that's something where we haven't quite squared that circle yet. Like we haven't quite taken those technological advancements and then implemented them into our everyday lives. And so I'm optimistic, but also you see that there's just a little bit more work that we have to do before these exciting developments actually become an everyday part of our fabric.
Before we pass the microphone on, would you be open to talking about something in particular, like something you've been seeing in your research space that might be one of these future aspects of day-to-day life that if we square the circle becomes normal for the rest of us?
Yeah, so I actually work in hydrogen storage. So it's so using hydrogen as a substitute for fossil fuels. And so if you use hydrogen in a fuel cell or a combustion engine, it doesn't generate any CO2, carbon dioxide. You just regenerate water as a byproduct. In addition, hydrogen can be made renewably, so it's a fantastic low carbon cycle. And so there's a lot of research that's been going on in this area, but the most exciting part for me was in the last couple of years, big industries have been looking at decarbonisation and have been making concrete commitments. So for example, I was working as part of a consortium that was looking at swapping over aircraft from fossil fuels to hydrogen, and to hear Airbus saying that they're getting their first hydrogen powered planes in the air, and this idea that it won't even be a choice for consumers, it will be the way that we fly, like that there'll be either drop-in fuels, sustainable aviation fuels, or hydrogen powered planes, and those commitments with hard deadlines, that makes me tremendously optimistic. And researchers who had been working as part of my group were heading up so some of the Fly Zero, Zero E programs with Airbus in Europe, and then seeing their commitment to actually implementing some of these technologies. I think that will have a knock-on effect, because if you have hydrogen power planes, you need hydrogen on the forecourts in large airports. And if you get, say, Heathrow, Frankfurt, Charles de Gaulle swapping over to hydrogen, that will have a knock-on domino effect for the rest of the world. So seeing things like that, I find that incredibly positive.
That's great. Thank you, Valeska. Like, that's news to me. So thank you. I might sleep slightly better tonight. Shaz, it would be great to hear from your perspective too. So we've just heard from Valeska about some of these cutting edge research developments that are happening. Can you talk to us from the perspective of being an educator in the school setting? What does it mean to be navigating through the advancing knowledge on climate change, as well as a lot of these advances in manifold solutions that are becoming quite realistic?
Okay, so that's a huge question. So to start off, to be the person or the teachers who are the ones who are, navigating the students through this. So Mark got to present that picture to a room and online audience full of really well-informed people who probably have been following the conversation for a long time. And probably, although it wasn't good news, we probably weren't surprised by the fact that it wasn't good news. Teachers get to present that information to students who the most they've ever seen about it is on TikTok. They may have a family at home who's engaged. They may have a family at home who's engaged on the total other side of the conversation as well. And a lot of the teachers who are presenting this information have not studied climate change specifically at university, or they've studied it quite a while ago, like in my case. And we all know how much the landscape's changed, in the last 3, 4, 5 years. To be navigating that and navigating the different sources of information, and to be delivering it to 14 to 18-year-olds who then look at you and they say, similar to what we heard just before, how can I have children? Or, I close my eyes and think about the future and I just see blackness. And it's really challenging. And it's a really complex landscape for teachers to be working in. Really important that we're getting the support from our school leaders and system leaders. And really important that we're forming communities and sharing practice. And in the context of Kildare, the work that we've done engaging with ANU experts to give us the confidence to speak in the space a bit more and to go further into the space with our students has been really important. And it's actually led to the partnership between ANU and Kildare and Catholic Education Diocese of Wagga Wagga, piloting a climate essentials course for teachers so that we can try and address that gap. Because the other thing is there's very, very few professional learning opportunities for teachers who want to, keep up to date or update or learn about it, to be able to get that information without delving into a master's, and it might only be for one bullet point of their course or whatever. So, really challenging, really complex space.
Yeah, thank you, Shaz. And just to emphasize that important role that teachers have as educators of young people that are being equipped to deal or to not deal or to engage or not engage with these pressing questions, but also being such important role models for how you manage your own response to this sort of information as well. So it's a huge responsibility, and we're so thankful to have you as a visiting fellow with the university and helping us to better look at how we can work as researchers, as whatever else it is that we do in the room to support educators. Thank you. Something that you mentioned at the end, you can give it to Zoe, it's going to be for Zoe. Something that you mentioned at the end was about shifting those ways in which people feel that they can talk about climate change in the school setting. Heard it cut out again. And so from the social psychological perspective, we might think of these as social norms, like what it's normal or acceptable to talk about, or how you dress or how you act. in a given setting. And this is an area of research that's quite relevant for Zoe, that Zoe's made a contribution to, as I mentioned, internationally recognised research in this space. So Zoe, I'm wondering, could you talk to us a little bit about the importance of social norms and what it means to be in different social settings, and how the sometimes unspoken, unwritten rules of those social settings can really guide the way in which people engage with issues like climate change?
Yeah, there's an increasing amount of research, not just in Australia, but across the world. We systematically underestimate how concerned the person is next to us about climate change. And that manifests in a couple of ways. We think people don't hold the same biospheric values as us. We think that we have greater biospheric values than others. In Australia, so we started surveying climate attitudes of people back in 2010. We found that 5% of the population that we surveyed would say, I don't think climate change is happening. When we asked our sample to estimate how prevalent climate denial was in Australia, they'd say, oh, 25%. It's just not the case. I've administered the same question as recently as November. The actual amount of people that would suggest that climate change isn't happening is now reduced to something like 2.5%. When we ask people to estimate the prevalence of climate denial, it's at 23%. So it's reduced a bit. So actual climate denial is more than halved. And it was not, it was insignificant back in 2010, and now it's almost, obsolete. But we haven't shifted people's perceptions of the prevalence of that denial. And I could give you, a intrapsychological reason of why that occurs.
Hang on. What?
So we could look at these misperceptions through the lens of psychology and come up with all these, flashy cognitive biases that shows, I like to self-enhance by thinking I'm the only person with these, special views who wants to help the environment. But I think a more cogent argument is that we have faulty misinformational cues in society, which gives rise to a perception that something like climate skepticism is more prevalent than it actually is. And that might be giving, media giving equal weight to both sides of the story, etc. Misperceptions on their own are, you might say, well, we're really bad at judging judging what other people are thinking and doing. If that's all it is, just bad judgment, that's, it's not particularly a problem. But we do find that these misperceptions have consequences. And what we find is that people who underestimate the concern of others the most also have reduced levels of efficacy that we can actually make a difference, and it demotivates sustained behaviour. So, it's almost self-reinforcing. Because the other effect it has is it inhibits our tendency to express our own views, because we think we're going to be met with social censure. It's like, well, I'm not going to say that the climate impacts will be massively severe because, I don't know, there might be 100 Andrew Bolts in the room, who knows. So I'll just be quiet about it and make my life easy. But that is what researchers refer to as a spiral of silence. And so, the less willing people are to express their own concerns, then that reinforces the misperceptions of the person next to you that actually, I don't think they're particularly concerned because they're not saying anything. So it does have consequences. It also has consequences for things like optimism and hope. So if we don't kind of attack those misperceptions, and you could argue that certain people are not constructive in helping us rectify those misperceptions, then that's consequential for our well-being as well.
Well, characteristically brilliant from Zoe Leviston. Thank you. Can you just elaborate a little bit more? I want to go back to what Anna Greta was saying about changing the world one conversation at a time. From that perspective from the psychological research, could you give comment on what a conversation may do in different social settings?
Yeah, it's a great line, great pithy one-liner, Anna Greta. It totally sums up the problem that the best way to correct misperceptions is to express your opinions, to undermine what we would politically call pluralistic ignorance. Have conversations, and especially in the context of these collective actions and not kind of marching up and down the square, but also, being part of the gardening group, as Hannah said, having conversations in that context, it totally kind of undermines the biases that are driving those misperceptions. So I think it's a great line.
Great, thank you. I might put a question to Valeska, if I may. This has come online, so I think I can probably start encouraging you in the room to think through your questions. We're getting some online on the magic screen in front of me. But Sean online asks how far away we are from hydrogen/green synthetic fuels being used commercially in aviation, road transport. So when we're looking to that example you gave us before, that it's quite an optimistic example to hear, how far away do you expect that to be?
Well, things like sustainable aviation fuels are being used now. So, and hydrogen as well has been tested on smaller aircraft. So not yet commercial large scale aircraft, but the technology is being used. And so the way I see it is at the moment the barriers are infrastructure. So it's like a bit chicken and egg. So similar to hydrogen powered cars, which have been around for a fair few years now. That technology has been proven, but like for widespread implementation, you need enough refueling stations. And without the refueling stations, there won't be as many people uptaking the technology. So I think the technology for sustainable aviation fuels and for hydrogen, so sustainable aviation fuels, it's sort of done and dusted. It's a drop-in replacement, so we can use it now. But the challenge there is infrastructure. So getting enough sustainable aviation fuels to be able to power the umpteen thousand flights that we have per year. And then hydrogen similarly, like there's a few more unknowns to do with like long distance flight with hydrogen, but those are being worked at, and the scale at which hydrogen is being used for aircraft it's astonishing how quickly we're progressing with that. And so I think now the barriers are it's economic, it's the investment in the infrastructure, and it's got to be coordinated across different countries as well, which makes it a bit more of a challenge. But yeah, I would like to say that it's not insurmountable. It's just a matter of there being enough will.
Well, we've chosen to be hopeful, so we'll say, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. But following on from that, I want to put a question to Shaz that kind of extends on the example we've had from Valeska, but an anonymous questioner online asked, they said, we hear so much about the negative progress of climate change. How do we make sure that we are sharing the success stories from the large-scale technological successes to the local stories of change? So I'd be interested from your perspective when you're moving through the classrooms at your own school, but also your engagement more broadly in the educational space. Are examples like this one that we've heard from Valeska about the aviation fuel replacement being ready to go? We just need to sort out the rest of the puzzle. Are they there? Are they accessible for teachers, for young people?
It's a yes and no answer. We absolutely love those stories and we need more of them. If anyone in the room or watching this is involved in something like that, please, not start communicating it, but we need to find a way to get that communication to teachers and that sort of thing. You get it to teachers, you can get it into, so many households across the country. And those stories are the ones that we use to give hope. We have to tell our students to imagine and to dream and, you know, close your eyes and, you know, this is what it could be. And those stories help us do that with the students and help the students see that there is something to be hopeful about in the future. We love lots of little anecdotes and 5-minute videos, and we can get some of them, but it can be really hard to know how reliable it is, and for teachers to get across it. One thing I would also like to say, every subject area has got a teachers association, and every teachers association has a journal and a conference, and they call for submissions regularly, especially for journals. So if you've got, you know, students or something like that, and you've got the opportunity to make submissions to those journals, it gets it into teachers, into pretty much every school. Every school is pretty much signed up to these organisations. And from there, it gets into classrooms, and then it gets into households. And once it's getting spoken about at the kitchen table, then all of a sudden it's not something futuristic for 2050. It's something that's happening now, it's something that's real, and it's something that's achievable.
Amazing. Thank you, Shaz. So for any researchers in the room, there's your pathway to impact when you've got a good news story or something helpful that you want the society more broadly to know about. Think about these networks and these channels that teachers have available to us. I'm going to take another question from online, and if you got questions in the room, can you signal to me while I'm looking around, and then I'll start coming to you shortly. But the one online, I'll put it to Zoe. Layla asks, to what extent do you think the media plays in contributing to the misperception of how prevalent climate change denial is? And then in parentheses is the point given the concentration of media ownership in Australia. So perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about how it is that we take cues from the world around us and how media fits into that ecosystem that informs us on what we expect other people think and what's normative for ourselves.
This is being recorded.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll just
Straight onto Sky News.
Sanitized version is probably a significant amount, and not necessarily, because of nefarious motives. Like the equal weight to each side of the story is not, it's not trying to purposely undermine something. It's a long kind of journalistic tradition that is great when you're tossing up opinions, but not so great when you're debating facts. Of course, and we could talk about media ownership, but let's park that to one side and would talk about something like the rise of online media, because no one trusts mainstream media. No one trusts social media, but we still consume it a lot. And of course, I think that the exacerbating factor of echo chambers being such an issue in social media is hugely problematic. And it goes back to that original point about what our social circumstances are too, and how that shapes our perceptions. So we are more likely to hang around like-minded people, and people who think like us, maybe from the same socioeconomic backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds, or whatever the political backgrounds, which is more pertinent in the climate space. And that influences how we perceive, what is a majority view as well. So getting back to that example on, only 3% of people say that climate change is not happening, but people think that 22 to 25% of Australians think that way. If you just look at the people whose own view is, I don't think climate change is happening, we get them to estimate the prevalence of that hardcore denial. They'll say, 50%, I think 50% of people think like me. And obviously, that there could be motivational underpinnings, because you don't want to, if you think that an opinion is somehow contentious or unpalatable, you'll kind of you'll have this false consensus in your mind to kind of appeal to the fact that, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. I guess we've all heard that line to excuse unpalatable viewpoints. But I think that's highly problematic in social media circles where, you know, the algorithms are shaped to less and less exposure to competing viewpoints. And I think that that's particularly problematic. So, you know, the real question is not, you know, what do people believe about, you know, the causes of climate change? It's what do we do about it? So it's getting to a consensus on policy response that is the frontier, and those same mechanisms that cause us to misperceive people's opinions about the environment also misshape our viewpoints on what people think is an acceptable policy response. And generally there is a strong appetite across the political spectrum for action on climate change, but the perception is nobody else wants it. And the perception is certainly the people who don't vote like me don't want it. So yeah, I think that's a thing to solve.
It's a fascinating social conundrum, and it sounds like part of the power of the conversations that can change the world are conversations that sort of push past that bubble that we can sometimes end up in, especially when we do have social bubbles that are kind of characterized by the sense of sameness and otherness, and being able to show that they aren't the boundaries for opinions on issues like climate change that truly do affect everyone. So thank you, Zoe, and I'll invite our questioner to put a question to the panel.
Thank you. Ross Calvert, retired engineer. And whilst I've heard some good news in the last hour or two, I'm afraid there's something that's still causing me a bit of anxiety, and that is there's a relatively small proportion of the population that is holding back the national effort to triple renewables penetration. And I'm referring to those who are getting in the way of increasing transmission capacity. And these poor people in many cases have been subject to misinformation, like they have a perception that renewable energy is more expensive and it's being rammed down their throat. And they also have some legitimate concerns, like valuable farmland potentially being taken out of productive use. So what are we going to do about this? It's partly in the hands of the renewables developers, who haven't been doing a good enough job in some cases of conveying to communities what the real benefits to them are. But interested to hear your views on how it can be concretely addressed.
Thank you for the question, Ross. So it's interesting that you say that keeps you up at night, because I think about the social impacts of the rollout of transmission lines, and that keeps me up at night, like perhaps a different side of the same puzzle there. So I think if there's an underlying theme or an overarching theme or a theme in some sort of vertical relation to the question that you asked, it's perhaps about this space of social reasoning and democracy, and how is it that we can navigate through a whole range of competing values and interests with the added complexity of a whole range of different informational sources. So Zoe, you've got the microphone. I think it also speaks to your expertise. So would you be open to commenting on some of these ways that maybe as collectives, and these might be in particular places like communities that are confronting decisions about energy infrastructure or otherwise, and also then as we abstract out into our online collectives or as a country, for instance, how do we make sense of these complex situations?
Look, it's a great question, and it made much more complex by there being legitimate concerns, and there are legitimate equity issues involved in this as well. It's not my area of expertise, but from what we do know about land use contestation, including some of the issues that we're looking at, is that people talk about two forms of justice. There's procedural justice, so the process you go through to reach a decision, and distributive justice. So how are those outcomes distributed? So let's say it's water allocation in a semi-rural area. Procedural justice is the process of establishing, okay, what's going to happen, and distributive justice is who gets the water and is it equitable. If you get the procedural part right, that's the important bit. And people are, and I'm not saying that it would necessarily translate in this case, but people are willing to compromise on distributive justice if procedural justice is done right, which includes involving all the stakeholders from the outset. And if you don't get that right, forget what the distribution looks like and whether people are getting fair compensation. It doesn't matter. People are just going to be angry about it. It's really difficult in this case because that transition needs to happen so randomly that you don't, you're really limited in the time of, trust building with the affected communities. So yeah, I think it's a huge challenge, but get the procedural justice as good as you can within the time frame.
Thank you, Zoe. And I imagine that probably speaks to some of the implementation challenges that you were talking about as well, Valeska. So how is it that we start to reshape our landscapes and our infrastructure? But importantly, what's the role of people in decision-making along there as well? Looking at the time, I've got a minute before I'm meant to wrap up the panel. So Zoe, those were your final remarks. Thank you very much for sharing them with us. Shaz, there's been some comments and questions that have come through thanking you for your comments and also endorsing the need for teacher education. But I wonder if you want to wrestle Zoe for the microphone, if you want to give us 30 seconds or so, just some closing remarks about education, social change, and what you see as being that important link from hearing Mark to having hope for the future. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. What I would probably finish with, and one point I would like to make is just in my experience and from my observation, pretty much everyone I know, whether or not they're actually passionate about climate change or not, is trying to do things in their own life and in their own households. And I think that's true for, most people. And we can see on a larger scale that there is movement happening, and Mark highlighted some of that in his talk. I think that there's an opportunity, though, to leverage our community level organisations and institutions and to bring those in. And we know from solar panels, EVs, all of that sort of thing, people will buy it once they know 3 or 4 or this person they know bought it or whatever. And that process of normalisation is really important. And I think that there's an opportunity to further activate our community level organisations and to think about how is it that people are actually encountering this in their day-to-day life with people they know, people they trust, in a way that makes it something they're going to take on, not because we're all climate warriors, but because it just makes sense to do so. And it's just the next thing that we do. A lot of people will just follow the crowd. They haven't, and Rebecca Huntley's research tells us this, they haven't got the capacity to digest it all, process it all, and, lead the pack on it. And so activating our community organisations, and schools are only one example of them, is an opportunity that we have to maybe get a bit more momentum.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Shaz. And Valeska, I'll invite you to make just a brief closing remark as well. And what I'd like you to give us is, if we're going to go away and have these conversations that inspire hope and action and meaningful action, what would be the snippet from hydrogen research, maybe in addition to what you've already told us, that we can take to our conversations with our family and our friends and be able to share some of these examples of technological development?
Well, I guess yeah, the take-home message that I'd want people to have is that these advances in these technologies that we need to be able to make the transition to net zero, like they're in majority they're already in existence. We just need to take that step, as Shaz was saying, about not being afraid of change. So normalizing the use of alternative sources of power, alternative modes of transportation, and sometimes making those that uncomfortable jump to doing something a little bit differently until it becomes normal, and then talking about it as well. Like, so talking about how, you know, if you use an electric vehicle, or if you use a hydrogen powered plane, like those like normalizing the use of new forms of power, like that will mean that that people start to see it as just a part of their everyday lives. They see the acceptance socially around these new technologies, and hopefully that's how we start the transition. But also I'd just like to shout out to what Hannah was saying about also using our voices and our collective action to prompt policymakers and ministers into making those hard decisions around the infrastructure or the investment into the energy transition, where like, so making sure that it's our collective voices and our collective vision, and making sure that policy and government follow through on that. I think that that's a real point of optimism, and it's something where we can all encourage each other to be to keep striving for that positive future. So yeah, so I guess that the message that I'd like to give is just that we have the tools at our disposal to be able to meet net zero. We just need to put our collective shoulders to the grindstone, yes, like and make those decisions and prompt policymakers to follow through on them.
Great, thank you, Valeska. I don't know, I personally will be switching my private jet over to hydrogen fuel as soon as we wrap up the event. Now, thank you all for those fantastic contributions. So I'm going to quick wrap up. I'm not going to thank anyone by name because I always forget people, and I feel bad about the ones that I forget. So if you had anything to do with today, thanks. But we will make time for a special thanks to our fantastic panel, Valeska, Shaz, and Zoe. Thank you so much. And thanks very much to the ICEDS team. And if you want to know more about Below Zero, there's Juliet. Can you wave? So you can hunt Juliet down and have a conversation. Thank you for being here, taking the time out, and don't get washed away by the floods as you're on your way home. Thank you.